ADX Florence, the one room the public was never allowed to see. A single metal door slams bang. The sound echoes like thunder inside a concrete tunnel. A guard's flashlight cuts through the darkness. The beam shakes, not because the guard is scared, but because something inside the room just moved. This room isn't on any public tour. It isn't shown in documentaries. Even most ADX Florence staff were never allowed to step inside it. Suddenly, scratch. A harsh dragging sound hits the door from the other side. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The guard freezes. The second guard, whispering tightly. "Did you see that? No one's supposed to be in there." The camera moves close to the steel door. Deep gouges are carved across the bottom, as if someone had been scraping at it for years. Thump. A slow, chilling, rhythmic thump. Not fast. Not panicked. Controlled. Steady. Like a message. The guards step back. A senior officer rushes in and snaps. "No cameras. No logs. Nobody saw this. Clear the hallway now." The door shakes. Dust drops from the concrete ceiling. The screen cuts to black. A narrator speaks calmly, slowly. ADX Florence is called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, but there is one room the public was never allowed to see. A room with no windows, no number, and no official record. Today, we uncover the truth behind it. The prison built to erase noise, movement, and hope. ADX Florence sits in the mountains of Colorado, surrounded by fencing, razor wire, motion sensors, buried pressure plates, and towers that watch every direction. People call it the last stop, the prison where inmates go when every other prison fails. Inside, almost everything is designed to remove sound, movement, and human contact. Cells are built with thick concrete, angled walls, and even shower systems that run on timers so nobody ever touches another person. But deep inside the prison, beyond the normal blocks, beyond the administrative areas, there is a corridor most people never hear about. A hallway with no signs. No window. No camera label. Just a long stretch of concrete that leads to a steel door. A door that doesn't match the rest. Unlike every other door in ADX, this one has no cell number, no inspection checklist, no feeding slot, and no official listing on the internal map. To staff, it was simply called the Sublevel Observation Room. But even that name wasn't written anywhere. New guards were told only one thing. Do not open that door. Do not ask who has access. Do not include it in your daily reports. Most didn't question it. At ADX Florence, asking questions is a fast way to lose your job. But over the years, strange stories spread through the staff. Some guards said they heard tapping. Others said they heard whispering. One officer claimed he saw movement beneath the door, a shadow sliding across the gap. But officially, the room didn't exist. So what was inside? Some believed it was an abandoned disciplinary cell. Others thought it was used for high-risk psychological evaluations. Some rumored it held old equipment from experiments done in the early days of the prison. But the truth, the real truth, was something far more controlled, far more secret, and far more unsettling. Because this room had a purpose. And only a few people, very few, ever knew what that purpose was. The narrator slows the pace. To understand the room, we must first understand why ADX Florence needed a place so hidden, so silent, so restricted, that even the staff weren't allowed inside. The camera drifts past razor wire, isolation cells, soundproof walls, and the empty concrete yard known as the cage. We settle on a narrow staircase descending underground. Dust floating, lights humming, silence stretching. The voice continues. The answer begins with a special category of inmate, one so rare, so unpredictable, and so difficult to contain that no standard cell in America could safely hold them. A door creaks open in slow motion. We fade out. The inmate's too dangerous for any cell. The staircase into the sublevel feels colder than the rest of the prison. Not because of air conditioning, but because this part of ADX Florence wasn't built for daily use. It was built for containment. At the bottom of the stairs, two thick reinforced doors stand side by side. Most guards walked past them their entire careers without ever seeing them opened. Yet hidden behind those doors was a category of inmate the public rarely hears about. Not gang leaders. Not escape artists. Not violent offenders. These were individuals who created disorder without touching anyone, who could disrupt entire blocks with only their minds, their voices, or their extreme unpredictability. The narrator explains slowly, simply. ADX Florence was designed for control. But some inmates, their presence alone created chaos. There were men who would scream for 20 hours straight, day after day, causing whole units to lose sleep. Others who threatened self-harm in ways that required constant monitoring. A few who reacted violently to light, sound, or even the presence of staff. They weren't placed in the hole. They weren't placed in medical. They were placed in something else. The extreme observation rotation. But even that system had limits. One former officer told investigators, there were maybe 2 or 3 inmates in the whole country who couldn't be housed anywhere. Not even here. They needed more than isolation. They needed removal. Removal didn't mean disappearing. It meant being held somewhere that prevented every possible stimulus. A space where no sound could travel, no objects could be broken, and no movement could become dangerous. That space was the hidden room. But how did the prison decide who went there? The narrator continues. Imagine a person who responds unpredictably to everything: noise, light, footsteps, even air movement. A single trigger could send them into panic or violence. ADX Florence was built to control chaos, but these inmates lived inside it. For safety, they couldn't be in a regular cell. And they couldn't be in the medical unit long-term. So a tiny group of specialists, psychiatrists, high-ranking officers, and federal officials created an emergency protocol. Used the sub-level room for short-term stabilization. But the process was highly secret. Only the warden, 2 officers, and a mental health director had keys. There was no schedule. No paper trail. No recorded assignments. When an inmate lost control or showed signs of extreme instability, the hallway outside the room would be cleared. Lights dimmed. No radios allowed. And the inmate would be escorted down the stairs by a specialized team. Some walked quietly. Some screamed. Some refused to move at all. Then the door would open, and the inmate would step inside the room nobody else ever saw. The narrator pauses. But what exactly was inside that room? Why did it need to be hidden, even from staff? And what happened to the inmates who entered it? The camera zooms toward the unmarked door again, the same door from the hook. That slow, heavy thump echoes once more. The room with no light, no sound, and no history. The steel door slowly cracks open. A cold breath of air slips out, still, heavy, unmoving. Inside the room, everything feels wrong. Not violent. Not haunted. Just empty. A kind of emptiness that makes your brain feel too loud. The narrator begins softly. The hidden room at ADX Florence wasn't designed like a normal cell. It wasn't meant for punishment. It was meant to remove the world itself. Inside, the walls are not concrete blocks like the rest of the prison. They are smooth, curved, thick slabs, built to erase sound instead of echo it. No vents. No bars. No metal furniture. Nothing that could clang, rattle, scrape, or break. Just one piece of molded structure in the floor. A built-in sleeping platform, shaped from the same material as the walls. Everything is gray, the kind of gray that doesn't reflect light. The lights themselves are hidden, soft, barely glowing. And they are controlled from outside the room, not inside. The camera pans slowly across the walls, revealing tiny holes. Not for cameras, but for airflow, invisible and silent. No window. No toilet flush noise, even that was sound dampened. No edges. No sharp corners. It was a space made to feel like nowhere. The narrator explains. ADX called this an observation environment. But that phrase doesn't capture what the room really did. It removed every outside influence, sound, movement, objects, even time. A guard once described it as a room where you hear your own heartbeat louder than footsteps. Another said, 10 minutes inside feels like hours. An hour feels like a day. The room didn't punish the inmate. It stabilized them. If someone was overwhelmed by sound, the room was silent. If someone reacted violently to objects, the room had none. If someone needed total separation, the room provided it. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the room. It was the rule attached to it. No recording devices allowed. No cameras. No audio. No visual logs. No one, outside a tiny circle, was allowed to document what happened inside. The narrator continues. ADX Florence is one of the most controlled environments in the world. But even here, some moments were kept off the books. The room wasn't used often, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. Sometimes the inmates stayed for hours. Sometimes for days. Always monitored from behind a sealed panel. Always documented verbally, never written. Always considered temporary, though nobody could define how long temporary meant. Then the narrator shifts. But if the room was meant to calm chaos, why did guards hear scratching? Why did they hear tapping? And why, if it was only for stabilization, did inmates claim they remembered things that the staff said never happened? The screen zooms in on the faint gouges near the bottom of the door. The same marks shown in the hook. A whisper-like breath of air moves through the hallway. Someone, had been inside long enough to leave marks. The scratches, the taps and the incident no one could explain. For years, the hidden room functioned quietly. An inmate was brought in, stabilized, observed, and returned to a normal unit. Most officers barely acknowledged the room existed. But then, there was the incident. It happened during a winter night shift, when the prison was cold, silent, and still. Snow outside muted every sound. Inside, only the hum of fluorescent lights filled the hallways. 2 officers were on sub-level duty. They followed the same routine. Walk the hallway, check each door, document nothing about the unmarked room. Everything was normal. Until one officer stopped. He leaned closer to the unmarked door. And whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first, it sounded like distant movement. Faint, almost imagined. But then it repeated. Slow. Perfectly spaced. The officers froze. There wasn't supposed to be anyone in the room. Not that night. Not that month. The room was listed as unused. One officer stepped toward the door. Steady. Cold. Intentional. The narrator steps in softly. When an inmate tapped like that, it usually meant they wanted attention. But the room was empty. Or, it was supposed to be. The officers called the watch commander. Protocol said all 3 must be present before opening any restricted door. When the commander arrived, he placed his ear against the steel. This time, it wasn't tapping. It was scratching. Light, slow, deliberate scratching, scraping up the inner side of the door. He stepped back immediately. His face lost all color. One officer whispered, "Sir, who's in there?" The commander didn't answer. Instead, he radioed upstairs, not for guards, but for a mental health supervisor. That was the first red flag. They waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The scratching stopped. Then the lights flickered. Not the whole block, just the lights above the hidden room. A hum crackled through the vents. Dust fell from the ceiling. The air grew heavier. The mental health supervisor arrived, carrying a small folder with no label. He asked only one question. Did the door shake? The guards looked at each other, shook their heads. The supervisor exhaled with relief, as if something very specific could have happened, but didn't. The narrator adds context. In a place like ADX, every reaction matters. A sound can be normal. A vibration can be routine. But a shaking door, that would have meant something else. Finally, the commander gave the order to open the room. Lock by lock, the metal clicked and disengaged. The door swung inward slowly. The flashlight beam swept across the empty room. No inmate. No movement. No disturbance. Nothing touched. Near the sleeping platform, at floor level, there were fresh marks carved into the wall. Thin lines. Short strokes. Just like the ones on the inside of the steel door. One officer whispered, "How old are those?" The supervisor answered quietly, "Less than an hour." The guards froze. That meant someone, or something, had been doing the scratching while they stood in the hallway. But no camera captured anything. And there was no sign of forced entry. The narrator slows the pace. That night, the officers filed no official report. Not because they didn't want to, but because they were told not to. No paperwork. No logs. No discussion. The watch commander ended the briefing with a single sentence. The room was empty. That is the story. But the officers knew what they heard. Clear tapping. Slow scratching. Fresh marks. Someone, or something, had been on the other side of that door. And that incident changed everything inside ADX Florence. Because for the first time, the question wasn't, what is inside the room? But rather, why was the room designed for something they never explained? The file that didn't exist. After the scratching incident, something changed inside ADX Florence. Officers who had worked in the sublevel hallway for years suddenly found themselves reassigned to new posts. Shifts were rotated. Patrol patterns were altered. Supervisors stopped casually walking through the corridor. It was as if everyone wanted to avoid the unmarked door. But one officer, known for being careful, curious, and quietly stubborn, couldn't let it go. The tapping. The scratching. The fresh gouges. The rushed arrival of the mental health supervisor. None of it made sense. So, on his day off, he did something simple, something harmless, something any officer could do. He requested access to archived logs from the prison's early years. Not looking for anything big. Just looking for records of maintenance, construction notes, emergency repairs, anything that might mention the hidden room. The narrator explains calmly. ADX Florence opened in 1994. Its early records are some of the most tightly controlled documents in the federal system. But most of the information is routine, blueprints, staffing rosters, training manuals. The officer dug through hundreds of pages. Nothing. Not even a reference to a sub-level observation room. So he went further. He requested internal maps, redacted versions, the same ones used for orientation training. He flipped through pages until he found the basement layout. Everything looked normal. Utility tunnel, water main X, electrical control, storage room, mechanical bay. But something strange appeared on the map. A wall. A smooth, continuous wall with no door. But the problem was obvious. In real life, that wall was exactly where the unmarked door stood. The narrator slows down. On paper, the room truly didn't exist. No label. No square outline. No indication that a room had ever been built there. Just empty space. The officer asked the records clerk, "Is this the only floor plan?" The clerk shrugged. "That's the official one." But official wasn't helpful. The officer needed original. A week later, he filed a quiet request for the earliest construction blueprint of the sublevel. When the envelope arrived, he opened it inside his car, not inside the prison. He unfolded the massive sheet. Concrete hallways, mechanical rooms, staircases, emergency exits, and then a small square, a perfectly drawn square, placed exactly where the secret room was. But instead of a room name, instead of a number, instead of the usual architectural symbols, there was only one handwritten note. R13 rotation unit, temporary use only. R13. A label that never appeared in later maps. The narrator explains. Most cells in ADX Florence have names that follow a system: A block, B range, Echo unit, J range. But R13? That designation was never used anywhere else in the prison. The officer tried to search for R13 in the digital database. Nothing. He searched in the disciplinary logs. Nothing. He searched in medical files. Nothing. It was like the name was erased. The only place R13 existed was on that single blueprint from the early 1990s. But there was one more detail, barely visible in the corner of the page. A signature. Not a guard's. Not the warden's. Not an engineer's. A signature from a federal oversight official with a clearance level far above normal ADX operations. The officer whispered to himself. So the room wasn't made for the prison. It was made for the government. He folded the blueprint carefully. sat in his car in silence, and realized that the scratching noises, the intense secrecy, might have been connected to something created long before any current staff even worked at ADX. Why Art 13 was built before ADX even opened. The officer couldn't shake the feeling that R13, the hidden room, wasn't just another part of the prison. It felt older, more secret, more intentional. So he began reading through federal memos from the early 1990s, documents about building ADX Florence, back when the government wanted a place that could safely house the most difficult inmates in the country. The narrator speaks clearly. ADX Florence was built after a series of dangerous incidents in federal prisons. The government wanted a facility that guaranteed safety and control. But some early memos mentioned something else, an additional concern. Not violence. Not escape attempts. Not riots. Instability. A specific category of inmates who reacted unpredictably to noise, isolation, or stimulation. Not because they were violent toward others, but because they couldn't handle the pressures of long-term confinement. These individuals needed a space free from loud sounds, bright lights, sudden movement, objects that could be misused, overwhelming environments. The narrator softens the tone. Federal experts argued that a new type of room was needed, a safe, controlled environment where highly unstable inmates could be monitored without risk. And that's when the officer noticed something unusual. The earliest construction notes didn't call R13 a cell. They called it a sensory control stabilization room. A calm, controlled space designed to prevent panic, overstimulation, or dangerous reactions. But something still didn't add up. If this was a medical space, why was it hidden? Why wasn't it listed anywhere? Why did guards hear strange tapping and scratching inside? So the officer dug deeper. He requested access to old mental health guidelines from the early years of the prison system. He found a section discussing inmates who struggled with severe sensory overload, unpredictable reactions to confinement, episodes triggered by noise or movement, difficulty adjusting to standard isolation units. The guidelines recommended temporary placement in a silent, padded environment where outside stimulation was reduced. But the officer didn't stop there. He searched for mentions of silent rooms or sensory cells in other federal prisons. He found none. R13 was unique. The narrator explains. If the room was meant to protect inmates in crisis, it made sense that it needed to be quiet, controlled, and carefully monitored. But it didn't explain the secrecy, the erased records, or the feeling that something else was going on inside. The officer returned to the blueprint. That handwritten note. R13 rotation unit. Temporary use only. What was the rotation? Why temporary? And why did it appear only in early documents, never in later ones? He traced the signature on the blueprint to a high-ranking federal official who oversaw sensitive programs. This person didn't normally handle construction. They handled classified safety procedures. Programs designed to manage extremely vulnerable inmates. Programs the public never heard of. The officer whispered. So this room wasn't punishment. It was protection. Protection from the environment. Protection from overwhelming sensory input. Protection during unpredictable episodes. But then one question hit him harder than the rest. If the room was built to help inmates, why were officers hearing scratching? Why the tapping? Why the shaking door? Why did fresh marks appear inside even when the room was empty? Something didn't match. The room wasn't as empty as they were told. Or something was happening inside that the staff didn't understand. The narrator ends the chapter on a quiet note. R13 was built before ADX opened. But the truth about how it was used and who was placed inside remained a secret that even veteran officers couldn't uncover. The camera moves slowly toward the unmarked door again. A faint, barely audible tap echoes, once, then stops. The inmate who remembered the room. 4 years, the hidden room known as R13 stayed off the record. Most inmates never heard of it. Most officers never saw it. And the few who did were told to forget it existed. But then something unusual happened. An inmate, quiet, calm and serving time in a normal ADX unit, began telling medical staff about a room he remembered being inside, even though his file said he'd never been placed there. He wasn't violent, wasn't known for causing trouble, didn't have a history of creating disturbances. He simply said, "I've been in the gray room before. The one with no corners." The staff member paused. There was no official gray room in ADX Florence. But the inmate continued. "It was cold, quiet, too quiet. You could hear your own breathing and nothing else." The medical staff assumed he was talking about a standard isolation cell. But then he described details he shouldn't know. Curved walls, the platform molded into the floor, a ceiling light hidden behind a matte panel, air vents so silent they felt like they weren't there, a door that closed without echo. The staff froze. Those details matched R13 exactly. But his file, every record ever logged, showed no emergency transfers, no psychological rotations, no placement in any special unit. According to ADX documentation, he had never left his assigned block. The narrator explains. For an inmate to recall something that was never written in his file meant one of two things. Either the records were incomplete, or something happened during a time the staff didn't document. The medical staff asked one question gently. "What do you remember most about the room?" The inmate looked down at his hands and spoke slowly. "The sound. Someone tapping. At first it was behind the walls. Then it felt like it was behind me." The staff member blinked. "Someone else was in the room?" The inmate shook his head. "No. It wasn't a person moving around. It was like the room was making noise." The narrator clarifies calmly. This was not a supernatural claim. Many soundproof rooms create unusual sensations, pressure changes, vibrations, or the faint hum of air systems. But the inmate's description went further. He said the tapping came in sequences. Not random. Not frantic. 3 taps. The pause. 3 more. The pause. The same rhythm the officers heard during the scratching incident. The medical staff didn't know what to say. So the inmate added one more detail. "When I opened my eyes the second time, I wasn't in the room anymore. I was in my normal cell. I don't remember walking back." A transfer without recall. A memory without paperwork. And details matching a room he shouldn't know existed. Word of the conversation quietly reached the officer who had found the blueprint. He met privately with the medical staff member and asked, "Did he describe the door?" The staff nodded. He said the door made a heavy sound when it closed. Not like metal hitting metal, more like a vault. The officer felt a chill travel across his arms. That description was perfect. He asked one more question. "Did he describe the scratches?" The staff hesitated, then slowly replied. "He said he remembers marks on the wall near the floor. He said he didn't make them." The room went silent. The officer leaned back and realized something he had never considered before. Maybe the scratching wasn't from a mystery inmate. Maybe inmates placed in R13 during psychological crises simply had no memory of their time inside. So when they returned to normal cells, they believed they had never left. Meaning, the room was being used, just never recorded. Before leaving, the inmate had said one last sentence. "I don't know why I was in that room. But whatever it's used for, it shouldn't be used often." The narrator closes the chapter softly. His story matched too many details to be coincidence. The room wasn't a legend. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't forgotten. It was hidden and used very sparingly only when someone reached a level of instability that regular isolation couldn't handle. The night the door shook, months passed with no new activity. No scratching. No tapping. No unexplained noises from R13. Many officers tried to forget the incident ever happened. But the officer who discovered the blueprint, he couldn't let it go. Then one night, during another cold shift, something happened that forced the truth out into the open. It began with a vibration. Not loud. Not violent. But unmistakable. A faint rumble rolling through the sublevel floor, like machinery turning on somewhere deep beneath the prison. The officer paused in the hallway and pressed his palm to the concrete. He felt it again. The He called for backup. 2 more guards arrived. All 3 stood silently in front of the unmarked door. The vibration grew stronger. Then, everything stopped. Silence. Stillness. Nothing. The guards exchanged cautious glances. The narrator explains. In a place designed for silence, any unexpected vibration can mean equipment failure, environmental changes, or an inmate crisis. So, following strict protocol, they contacted the watch commander. He arrived quickly, too quickly, as if he already knew something was happening. Before anyone could speak, a deep, heavy boom struck the inside of the door. All 3 officers jumped back. Another boom. Louder. Controlled. And then, thump, thump, thump. The same rhythm as before. The same steady sequence the inmate remembered. The same tapping pattern the officers heard months earlier. Only now the sound wasn't faint. It shook dust from the ceiling. The watch commander raised his voice. Nobody touches that door. Nobody speaks. Step back. The officers froze. The commander leaned forward, listening carefully. His face tightened. He whispered into his radio. Activate mental response protocol. Level 3. Level 3 was the highest emergency classification for inmates' psychological instability. Clear the area. Prepare medical staff. Secure restraints. Notify administration. Lock down nearby units. R13 wasn't supposed to have an inmate inside. So who, or what, was causing the door to shake? The vibrations suddenly stopped. Then, silence. The commander waited 30 seconds. Then ordered, "Open it." The locks disengaged one by one. The door slid open. Flashlights pointed inside. The room was empty, perfectly still. But on the floor, fresh, unmistakable, were 3 new scratches, identical in length and direction. Exactly 3. The guards looked to the commander for answers. He closed the door gently, turned to them, and said the sentence that ended all discussion. This room is functioning as intended. Do not question its purpose again. The narrator pauses. That was the last night staff ever reported noises from R13. But not because the sound stopped. Because after that night, officers were reassigned and the hallway was restricted permanently. The blueprint was locked away. The inmate who remembered the room was transferred. And the officer who discovered the truth was moved to an entirely different unit. R13 returned to silence. Just as it was designed to. The room that was never supposed to be found. The camera pans out from the unmarked steel door. Its surface cold. Still featureless. But the scratches remain. 3 marks near the bottom, barely visible unless the light hits them just right. The narrator speaks softly, in a slow cinematic close. ADX Florence is known for its isolation, its silence, and its strict control. But deep inside its walls lies a room the public was never meant to see. A room built not to punish, not to torture, but to stabilize those who reach the edge of crisis. A gray room with no corners. A door without a number. A space erased from every map except the very first one. A room used only when absolutely necessary, so rarely that many officers never knew it existed. And yet, it left behind traces. A forgotten blueprint. A shaky memory from a quiet inmate. Unexplainable tapping in the dark. Fresh scratches no one could account for. The narrator continues. The truth behind R13 isn't supernatural. It's human. A reminder that even in the most secure prison on Earth, there are individuals whose minds respond to confinement in ways no standard cell can handle. For the people who needed that room, it wasn't a mystery. It was a last line of protection, a controlled environment meant to prevent harm when everything else failed. For the officers who heard the sounds, it was a chilling reminder that silence can be louder than noise. For the system that built it, R13 represented one thing: control over the uncontrollable. And for the rest of us, it remains a locked door in the deepest part of a prison almost no one will ever see. A room with no records, no photos, and no official history. Only whispers. Only scratches. Only questions. The screen fades to black. The final line appears. Inside ADX Florence, Every door has a purpose. But some doors were built never to be opened.